Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sheviit. We're up to Perek Daled Mishnah Aleph. Today's Mishnah should be Le'ilui Nishmat Nerev ben Svetlana Aranbaev Menuchato Began Eden. Amen. Rabotai, in the previous chapter, Mishnayot 5 through 9, we discussed, the Mishnayot taught us that a person is generally not allowed to remove stones from his own field on Shemitah because he gives off the appearance that he's clearing the ground for planting. Now, this prohibition applies not only to removing stones, but also to removing similar objects like sticks and grasses. Now, the Mishnah today is going to teach us that removing stones and the like was originally mutar to a certain extent, but later on it became asur. And the Mishnah writes like this: בראשונה היו אומרים מלקט אדם עצים ואבנים ועשבים מתוך שלו כדרך שהוא מלקט מתוך של חברו. Originally, the Chachamim would say that a person can gather sticks, stones, and grasses for a permitted purpose, like firewood, building, animal food, and the like, from his own field, in the way that he gathers these items from another person's field. Meaning, just like a person can gather these items from another person's field, because no one will suspect you of clearing his field for planting, so too you are allowed to gather them from your own field, provided you do not give off a suspicion that you're clearing the field to plant. Eta gas. Therefore, he's allowed to gather the large ones, which is the sticks, from his own field, because since he leaves the small ones, he's not going to be suspected of clearing his field. And the Mefarshim explain that when a person gathers sticks from the field of another person, he can take all types of sticks, large and small, because it's unusual to clear someone else's field for planting, and therefore no one's going to suspect you of working for that purpose. But when you remove sticks from your own field, in which case people would suspect you for clearing your field for planting, you have to avoid giving off that impression, which is achieved by taking only the large ones and leaving the small ones. Now, the Tverat Yisrael points out to us that when the Mishnah says in the way that you gather another person's field, it's not talking about the method of gathering. It means the reason you are allowed to gather applies in both cases. Just like you can gather anything from your neighbor's field because you're not going to arouse suspicion of clearing the field, so too you can collect large sticks from your own field for the same reason. And the Mishnah continues, Mishirabu Ovrei Avera, when the number of sinners increased who gathered even small items from their field, but they claimed they only took the large ones, which the Mefarshim explain that the sinners, they were afraid to violate the halacha openly, so they would break the law only if they could pretend that they were acting in a mutar fashion. How did they do it? Since you are allowed to remove large sticks, what would they do? They would take small sticks and claim that they were really taking the large ones. But once it came asur to gather sticks of any size, they lost this way to trick people, and they had no choice but to obey the halacha. So the Mishnah continues, Misherabu Ovrei Avera, when the number of sinners increased, that they gathered even the small items from the field, but they claimed that they took the large ones, Hitkinu sheyeh zeh melaked mitoch shel zeh v'zeh melaked mitoch shel zeh. The Chachamim decreed that a person cannot collect anything except large items from the field of another person, shelo letovah, and he is not allowed to be shown any appreciation by the owner for doing so. And needless to say, that the owner cannot provide them with food. And the Mefarshim explain that literally the language of the Mishnah is that this one gathers from within the field of this one, and this one gathers from within the field of this one, meaning to say that you're not allowed to gather not only large items from your own field, but you can't even take small items from your friend's field. Therefore, you can only remove, the only thing left is to remove the large items from your friend's field. Now, Rabotai, the Mishnah here seems to contradict what we spoke about earlier in chapter 3, Mishnah 9, which allowed a person to remove shoulder stones from his own field. One solution that the Mefarshim give is that our Mishnah agrees that removing shoulder stones is mutar because they're extremely large. It's really prohibiting here only stones that are smaller than shoulder stones. Now, the Mefarshim explain that when the Mishnah says shelo letovah, you cannot be shown any appreciation by the owner for doing it, meaning to say that the owner, the Rambam explains, the owner cannot thank him or promise to do him a favor in return, because the Mefarshim explained, the Rav and the Tosfot Yom Tov, they bring down that it was very common for a person to collect sticks from his neighbor's field with permission to use as firewood. So the Chachamim were afraid that the neighbors would make an agreement to clear each other's fields by removing all the sticks, even the small ones. So to prevent this, the Chachamim decreed that the owner cannot show any sign of appreciation to someone who gathered large sticks from his field, so that he won't be encouraged to clear the property and remove even the small ones. And the Rav continues when the Mishnah says, needless to say, you cannot provide the owner cannot provide him with any food, meaning to say that a field owner cannot ask someone to collect wood and grass from his field in exchange for food, even if the gatherer will only take large items which would otherwise be allowed, because again, it gets into an issue of trying to circumvent the law. That is the Rabotai of Mishnah Aleph. Mishnah Bet is going to teach us when certain punishment applies to Shemitah or not. We know that somebody who violated the laws of Shemitah is punished in certain cases by being forbidden to cultivate his field in the year after Shemitah. So the Mishnah is going to teach us when this punishment applies and when it does not. Sadeh shenitkatzeva tizara b'motzei Sheviit. A field that was cleared of thorns on Shemitah can be planted after Sheviit, because even though it is forbidden to remove thorns from a person's field on Shemitah, the Chachamim did not penalize a person who did this. And Vashim explained that this forbidden work of removing thorns from the field is not so serious to warrant such a punishment that you can't cultivate the next year, because even after the thorns were removed, the ground is still not ready for planting. But if a field was improved, meaning it was plowed well, or a field in which animals were penned, meaning the owner confined animals to a section in the field where they left droppings that fertilize the soil, he cannot plant on that field after Shemitah. In these two cases, the Chachamim penalized the transgression. The Mifalshim explain that the Rav quotes the Yerushalmi on this point where he says that the field was improved. It means that the field was plowed well, which means that he plowed it twice. And the Mishnah is referring to a case where there was a certain dangerous time when the authorities, people in charge, they obligated farmers to pay a certain amount of produce each year, and they threatened to kill those who did not pay. So the Chachamim of that period, they permitted farmers to cultivate their fields on Shemitah so that they would have enough produce to pay the tax. But they did not allow the farmers to do more work than necessary. Therefore, they penalized the farmer who plowed his field twice, because a single plowing would have been enough. So when it says he plowed his field well, he improved it, it means in contrast to all the other farmers who plowed their field once to avoid this death, they didn't pay the tax, the punishment, these farmers plowed twice. Therefore, they incurred the penalty of not being able to cultivate their land for the next year. And when the Mishnah says, Sheni Daira, when the animals were penned in, we said in general that a farmer is allowed to enclose his animals in a pen in this field on Shemitah, even though they're going to deposit their manure, which is going to fertilize the soil, as long as he intends to heap the waste into storage piles and not leave it to spread out. We discussed this earlier in chapter 3, Mishnah 5, but the Mishnah now is referring to a farmer who did not pile up the manure when he was supposed to, but he left it where it fell. The Chachamim penalized him. Sadesh Sheni Taiva, a field that was improved in violation of Shemitah, Bet Shammai Amrim, Bet Shammai say, En ochlin perotah b'Shviit, we are not allowed to eat its produce on Shviit. Ubet Hillel Omrim ochlin, but Bet Hillel say that we can eat its produce. According to Bet Shammai, Shemitah produce cannot be eaten if it was grown in a field that was illegally cultivated on Shemitah. They learned this out from a pasuk that the Mepharshim explain in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 26, pasuk 25. Chapter 25, pasuk 6. Vayta Shabbat ha'aretz lachem le'ochla. The uncultivated produce of the land shall be yours to eat, which implies the mashmot is that only the produce of uncultivated land is mutar, but the produce of cultivated land is asur. But Bet Hillel allow a person to eat its produce because they hold that the Torah does not forbid eating produce of Shemitah, even if it grew as a result of forbidden work. They learn out this pasuk differently. Now, this is only the Oraita level, the biblical level. Everyone agrees that midrabanan, you are now allowed to eat sfichin, which we're going to speak about later on, certain types of produce that grew by themselves on Shemitah. So in Bet, he then say that it's permitted to eat produce that came from illegal work. They weren't referring to the species where Svechin applies, where this produce that grew on its own, like grains or vegetables. Rather, they were referring to the fruits of a tree where there is no Sifchin prohibition. We're going to discuss this more later on. Bet Shammai omrim en ochlin perot Sheviit betova. Bet Shammai say that a person cannot eat produce of Shemitah with a show of gratitude to the owner, because Shemitah produce is ownerless. And the Farshim explain that we know that the produce of Shemitah does not belong to the owner in the land in which it grew, because the Torah removes it from his ownership and gives everyone the right to come and take it. So for this reason, when somebody enters the field of another person on Shemitah to take his produce, he cannot thank the landowner. Why? Because he would give the false impression that it's the landowner's property when Hashem already said it's ownerless. Bet Hillel say we can eat Shemitah produce whether with the show of gratitude or whether without a show of gratitude. Rabbi Yehuda says that the opinions of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel are really reversed. Bet Shammai permit expressing gratitude, and Bet Hillel forbid it. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, it comes out that this is the lenient opinion of Bet Shammai and the stringent opinion of Bet Hillel. Because even though we know in most machlokot between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, Bet Shammai takes the more stringent opinion and Bet Hillel takes the more lenient one, according to Rabbi Yehuda, this machlokot would be an exception to the rule. And the Rab says, the halakha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. Rather, we say Bet Shammai is being strict, that you can't show gratitude to the owner, and Bet Hillel is being lenient, that you could show gratitude, or you don't have to, whatever a person wants to do. That is the Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.